Visit us at Eduvo. Thank you for calling Eduvo.
So having the button is good, but of course we want to actually add a new transaction when we press it. And for that, we first of all need to collect the user input. It's good that we have these text fields, but how can we get access to what the user entered? There are two ways of getting access. It's up to you which one you choose. It also depends on the complexity of the form you're building. The first way of getting access is that you simply save the user input with every keystroke, that you save it in a property. Now, for that, we need a property in which we can save it, and we can add it here to our widget. But keep in mind that this is a stateless widget. And what does this mean? It means that any data we have in there, like the transactions property, is immutable. We can't change it. Well, technically we can change it, but our changes will never be reflected on the user interface. Now, actually here that wouldn't be a problem, because with every keystroke we could save the data the user entered and then only do something once we hit a button. So it's actually okay if we just save these changes without updating the user interface, because there is no update we want to perform with every keystroke. We just want to save the data behind the scenes. And we can do that because a stateless widget is still an object, still a normal class, so we can have properties in there which we can change. We just can't rerun the build method. We can't use setState here. But again, that won't be needed. So what you can do therefore is you can add new properties here to your class. Maybe a string title input and another string amount input. That's, by the way, important. The input values are always strings by default. If you need a different value, like a number here for the amount, then you need to convert it manually. So we have these two strings. And now if we go down to our text fields, there you can add the onChanged listener. Now, onChanged will fire with every keystroke. As you see, you have a couple of other listeners too. onEditingComplete is fired when the user presses the done, go, or next, or whatever it is button in the soft keyboard. So that would basically be that button in the bottom right corner. That can have a different look and meaning, and you can configure that actually. By the way, you can ignore this here for now, this strange yellow thing here. So that is onEditingComplete. It's fired when that button is pressed. OnSubmitted is kind of related, but this fires whenever the done button is pressed. So not on every button in the bottom right corner basically, but only for that done button. And if you configured your text field to show a different button there, then it would not fire. And onTap is fired whenever you tap into the text field. Now here we need onChanged because onChanged fires for every keystroke. OnChanged then requires us to pass a reference, a pointer at a function, which takes a string value. So not a function that has no arguments, but a function that accepts exactly one argument, which is of type string, and that then returns nothing. You can use a named function here, or you define an anonymous function. However, as I just explained, it needs to be a function which takes a value. You don't need to add the type here because Dart is smart enough to infer this, because onChanged expects a function that takes a string argument. Dart automatically understands that value here will be of type string. You also don't have to name this value. You can name it val, whatever you want. So now we get this, we have this function. It will be triggered for every keystroke. And then in here, since we're editing the title here, we can set title input equal to val. So that means we overwrite the current value of title input with the input the user chose here. So with the current input of that text input, of the text field. We can do the same for the amount, add onChanged, here get the value, and then we can also use that shorter notation with the arrow because we have only one expression. There we can set amount input equal to val. With that, we have a setup where we register every keystroke, and now we save that in our title input and in the amount input. Again, the UI won't be updated because we're not calling setState, and we couldn't call it because we're in a stateless widget, but that's not required here. To prove that it worked here, when we press that add transaction button, I will print the title input, so the value we stored in there, and also the amount input. Let's save all of that. And again, you can ignore this yellow-black thing here at the bottom. I will explain what's up with that later. And for the moment, we can enter some amount here, like 12.99. And here we can enter a title like test. And you could use your physical keyboard for this too. If you then hit add transaction, you see test and 12.99 output here because these values were saved with every keystroke, and therefore we can also use them. The only thing we can't do right now is update our user interface based on that. Registering the input on every keystroke is perfectly fine. However, here Flutter actually complains or gives us a warning that this myHomepage class, which is marked as immutable, that's basically a flag the stateless widget sets, has a field, a property which changes or which is not final. And that's true. Title input and amount input are not final. They can change. And actually the case we have here is a pretty niche case. Normally you don't have changeable properties in a stateless widget because you can't update the UI based on these changes anyways. This is one of the rare cases where we save some data and where we are perfectly fine with that having no direct impact on the user interface. Still, you might want to consider turning this entire widget into a stateful widget to get rid of that warning and also to avoid an error which we'll run into later, or a little issue which we'll run into later, which I will fix later though. So we'll then see how to work around that. Nonetheless, for the moment, this here will work and we can leave it like this for the moment. Now, we'll have a problem anyways. I, of course, don't just want to print my results here. I want to create a new element or a new transaction, and that in the end should then also lead to some output on the screen because transactions, our list here, should then actually change and hold that new transaction. So we'll have to switch to a stateful widget at some point anyways. Before we do so, however, let me first of all show you an alternative to registering this manually on every keystroke. Whilst you can do this, and whilst this is especially useful if you have more complex logic that you maybe want to run on every keystroke, Flutter actually has a built-in mechanism that allows you to listen to every keystroke and then get the finished value once you're done. For that, I'll comment out the title input and amount input, and I'll add two new properties which now are final. And that is the title controller, which is created with a value of text editing controller. And it's the amount controller, which is also a text editing controller. Text editing controller is a class provided by Flutter, and you can assign such a controller to your text fields with the help of the controller argument. So now to the title text field, I add my title controller. And to the amount text field here, I'll add my amount controller. Now, what do these controllers do? Flutter automatically connects the controllers with our text fields, and these controllers in the end listen to the user input and save the user input. And therefore here in onPressed, we can then print title controller.text to get access to that saved text. Hence now if I go back and I type something here and I hit done, and I then add transaction, I see test here. So this is of course a more convenient way because you don't have to manually write a function that takes a value and just saves it in a property. And in addition, as an extra benefit, this is now also a solution because these properties are final and the heavy lifting of saving stuff is done by Flutter. This is now a solution Flutter also likes in a stateless widget. Nonetheless, the days of us using a stateless widget, or at least of only using stateless widgets, are coming to an end because we will have to change this to a stateful widget in order to update our list of transactions and reflect that change on the user interface, where of course for every new transaction, a new transaction card should be output down there.